co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story, and in this episode of Beyond Dramatica, I'd like to read to you an article that I wrote some time ago called innocuously Dramatica Scenes and Elements. Well, in fact, this is talking about the dramatic circuit that drives all stories, both their scenes and their acts and their sequences and events. But beyond that, it also has ramifications for how these same circuits of drama can be applied to psychology and describe the processes of the mind, both in individuals and in groups. So let me begin by reading the article, interjecting occasionally as I can bring some of that to bear, and then at the end giving you how this might be applied to psychology in the real world, not just the psychology of story. So, to begin, how does the construction of scenes relate to Dramatica's story elements? Well, the concept is that a complete scene, in structural terms, is a complete dramatic movement. In other words, there must be a potential, resistance, current, and outcome or power regarding a single issue to complete a scene. Very important. Potential, resistance, current, and power. That is what makes a scene have a movement as opposed to just being a static thing. In this way, we might think of each scene as a single dramatic circuit. Although it has a flow, the circuit is really seen as a unit, like a schematic, comprised of these four parts: potential, resistance, current, and power. Therefore, we don't necessarily have to start by putting up a potential and then introducing a resistance. Rather, we might start with a resistance, a brick wall, for example, and then introduce the potential, a herd of galloping wild horses. Well, clearly, just because we started with the resistance and then the potential, it can lead to a current when the two come into conjunction and the galloping herd of horses reaches the wall, which will lead to a particular outcome or power or perhaps a new potential. The order in which these elements in a scene, PRCP, potential, resistance, current, and power, need to be introduced is not merely storytelling, however. In fact, there is a specific structural order to it that's determined by the meaning or impact you wish to instill in your audience. This can be understood by realizing that if we take two events from a scene, say a slap and a scream, and then we find that a slap followed by a scream has a completely different meaning than a scream followed by a slap. In the first case, slap followed by a scream, depending on the context of the story, it might mean that a slap was struck in anger, leading to a scream in response for the emotional pain or hurt. But a scream might begin the scene, indicating perhaps hysteria, in which case following it with a slap would then mean that it's out of concern, perhaps, or tough love, to try and bring somebody out of that hysteria, to bring them to come to their senses. The Dramatica story engine actually predicts the order 1, 2, 3, 4 in a quad of those four elements, and the nature, potential, resistance, current, and outcome, PRCO or PRCP for power, of every element in a quad in the entire structure. Now that says a lot. Let me interject here. That's the entire structure right there. Look at that. I mean, that's large quads that are families, and within them smaller quads that are smaller families, getting down all the way to the bottom to the elements. And these elements represent processes. Each element is a process of the mind, or a process of dramatics in the case of story. And four of them go together to create a family, sort of like a periodic table of story elements. And those families then go together to create larger families under a larger umbrella, and so on until you get all the way to the top level. So each of those elements in there, and each of the collections of elements, are all different mental processes of different levels of magnitude, and each one has a 1, 2, 3, 4, or a potential, resistance, current, and power. In other words, every one of these little quads of four has a 1, 2, 3, 4, and a potential, resistance, current, and power. But it doesn't always have the same order, and potential doesn't always go in the same place in the quad. The Dramatica story engine predicts that, okay? And every element in the quad in the entire structure based on the impact that you've indicated by the choices you want to make in the story form. In other words, dramatically what you're trying to achieve will determine the order in which things will happen, just like a slap followed by a scream, or a scream followed by a slap. Okay? But the data is so extensive that it takes several hundred pages to print it out. And we determined when we were creating Dramatica that this flood of information would drown authors in a sea of numbers, far away from the intuitive sense of writing. And what's more, it's so specific that we thought it might lead to writing by the numbers, which we didn't want to happen. The biggest tragedy would be that the audience is not really concerned with that degree of detail so much and really needs to give that to the authors as a given, even if it's out of order, even if the potentials aren't quite what they should be or the resistances, as long as the pieces are there somewhere. So why worry about being accurate when it has little importance in the grand scheme of things in stories? However, when you get out of stories and start dealing with psychology or analyzing things in the real world, it's essential to have this information. But as a result, this information, though generated by the story engine in Dramatica, in every story form, has no means of extraction from the software at this time. You can't get at it. We can, having created it. You can't. It's just not in there. Perhaps someday we'll bring it out. Now, earlier we talked about the spiral nature of this structure in other videos. Why do I say it's spiral? Because if you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and this goes 1, 2, 3, 4. It works like this. First you do 1, 2, 3, 4 in the very first quad of a 1, 2, 3, 4 quad. And then you go through the second quad in a 1, 2, 3, 4 order, a 1, 2, 3, 4, a 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you move on to the next quad of quads, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you go on to the next. So you end up with spirals within spirals. In fact, one of the best ways is you work yourself up, because once you've gone through all 4 levels in the bottom one, then you move up to the next level and you go through the 1, 2, 3, 4s there in every quad. So every quad and every quad of quads has a 1, 2, 3, 4 and a PRCO or a PRCP. One of the things about this is that because there's 4 towers, you end up with a quad helix as opposed to a double helix in DNA, but you've still got 4 base items. You've got 4 elements: knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Those are the 4 building blocks. Just as there are 4 building blocks in DNA, well, you have 4 building blocks in Dramatica. We actually call it mental relativity. And those 4 building blocks go together to create this quad helix, which is effectively the genome of a particular psychology, and we call it a story form. Anyway, it can be applied in the real world in very real ways. So, having gone through all this, let's continue here where we describe the spiral in the article, and then say that the type level determines the dramatic circuits and acts, the second level down from the top. Okay, variation level determines the dramatic circuits of sequences. The character level determines the dramatic sequences of scenes, the sequence of scenes from one to the next, and the spiral takes us all the way back to the top level genre, which determines the dramatic circuits and events within each scene. So interestingly enough, the way it works in Dramatica, the top level, these highest levels of appreciation at genre, which is the largest thing in story structure, actually determines the smallest thing, which is the specific events within a scene, the PRCP, the 1, 2, 3, 4, within each individual scene. Okay, so in other words, the 4 required events for every complete dramatic movement at the scene level will be something situational, attitude, illustrative, activity, and exhibiting mentality. Universe, physics, mind, and psychology, just as we saw at the top. And structural scenes illustrate those 4 events in terms of the character, plot, theme, and genre, but there's no correlation. Character, plot, theme, genre, attitude, activity, mentality, situation. They can be applied in each of those areas. Storytelling scenes illustrate these 4 events, the genre-level events, in terms of audience impact. Impacting the audience's own situation, affecting their attitude, involving them in a vicarious activity, or exploring the way their minds run by illuminating their mentality. So, in the end, both structural and storytelling scenes can be presented in active or passive fashion, pertaining to the story or pertaining to the audience. Active scenes put them into motion, moving the story forward or invoking changes in the audience itself, and passive just illustrates, through analysis, the way things are. Now, obviously, all that can be applied in the real world to real psychology because we're dealing with the psychology of story. And the key here is that the systems of Dramatica were not designed to help explain story. They were discovered in story because they explain the way our minds work, the way the story mind works. And that view from the inside of story illustrates what's going on in the inside of our own heads as individuals or groups, just like characters have a psychology, and a group of characters have the psychology that is a single story mind in which they play different facets of that mind. Individuals in the real world have their psychologies, and they play a larger role in the groups in which they belong, which has a psychology of a single mind as well. Well, that's enough for this article, and we'll continue next time with another episode of Beyond Dramatica.